The blood on Josephine Ford's hands wasn't hers, but that didn't stop the whispers from following her like shadows as she rode into Park City, Utah, on a dust-coated mare in the summer of 1876. The mining town, nestled in the Wasatch Mountains, had grown prosperous from the silver veins that ran beneath the earth. But prosperity hadn't brought tolerance, especially not for a woman traveling alone with rumors trailing behind her like the tail of a comet. Josephine had learned to ignore the stares, the way conversations died when she entered a room, how mothers pulled their children closer when she passed. 23 years of life had taught her that people feared what they didn't understand, and no one understood her, not since the fever took her parents and left her with the visions. The main street of Park City bustled with activity despite the afternoon heat. Miners with coal-smudged faces trudged toward saloons, merchants hawked their wares from wooden storefronts, and ladies in fine dresses strolled beneath parasols, their eyes darting suspiciously toward the disheveled woman on horseback. Josephine's dark hair hung in tangled waves down her back. Her once fine riding dress was stained with trail dust, and her eyes, her strange, mismatched eyes, one blue and one green, scanned the street with the wariness of a hunted animal. All she wanted was a room, a bath, and perhaps a few days' rest before moving on. That's all she ever wanted in any town, but somehow trouble always found her. "You looking for something, miss?" a gruff voice called out. Josephine turned to see a burly man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. His hand rested casually on his holster, but there was nothing casual about the hard set of his jaw or the suspicion in his eyes. "Just a place to stay for a few nights," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "And perhaps work, if there's any to be had." The sheriff looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the blood that stained her sleeve. "What kind of work would a lady like yourself be seeking?" "I'm handy with horses," she said, "and I can cook and clean. I'm not afraid of hard work." "That blood yours?" he asked, nodding toward her sleeve. Josephine looked down at the rusty stain. "No, I helped a trapper with a wolf bite back in the mountains. I'm good with healing, too." The sheriff's eyebrows raised. "We've got a doctor in town." "Some folks prefer my methods," she said, immediately regretting her words when the sheriff's expression darkened. What methods might those be? Before Josephine could answer, a commotion erupted from the livery stable across the street. A massive black stallion burst through the doors, dragging a young stable hand who desperately clung to the lead rope. The horse reared, its powerful hooves slashing the air as the boy lost his grip and tumbled into the dirt. Without thinking, Josephine slid from her mare and strode toward the panicked stallion. She heard shouts of warning but paid them no mind. The horse's fear called to her, a pulsing energy she could feel like heat from a fire. "Miss, get back!" Someone yelled, but Josephine was already standing before the massive animal, her eyes locked with its wild gaze. She began to hum, a strange, haunting melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. The stallion's ears flicked forward, its nostrils flared, but its frantic movements slowed. Josephine raised her hand, palm forward, and continued her eerie tune. The horse lowered its head, blowing hot breath against her fingers. The street had gone silent. Josephine could feel the stares, could practically hear the thoughts racing through the onlookers' minds. Witch, sorceress, touched. "Well, I'll be damned," came a deep voice from behind her. "Never seen devil's fury submit to anyone, let alone a slip of a woman." Josephine turned to find herself looking up at a tall man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark blonde hair was pulled back at the nape of his neck, and his eyes were the color of a storm-washed sky. He wore dusty riding clothes, a worn leather vest, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. A cowboy, and judging by his confident stance, not just any ranch hand. The horse was scared, not furious, Josephine said, keeping her voice low. There's a difference. The corner of the man's mouth quirked up. Try telling that to the 3 men he's put in the doctor's care this month. He extended a hand. Mason Ironwood, that demon horse belongs to my ranch. Josephine hesitated before shaking his hand. Josephine Ford. Miss Ford, the sheriff interjected, having approached cautiously. That was quite a display. Just a knack with animals, she said, dropping Mason's hand and stepping back. A knack, the sheriff repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. You know, we've had reports from Silverton about a woman who performs strange rituals. A healer, they called her, until folks started dying of mysterious ailments. Josephine's heart sank. The rumors had followed her faster than she'd anticipated. I've never been to Silverton. That's so. The sheriff's hand returned to his holster. Because the description matches you right down to those peculiar eyes. The tension in the air thickened. Josephine calculated her chances of reaching her mare before the sheriff could draw his weapon. They weren't good. Sheriff Burke, Mason Ironwood said, stepping between them. I've been in Silverton within the month. The woman they're hunting is at least 40 years old with a scar across her face, hardly a match for Miss Ford here. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. You vouching for this stranger, Ironwood? I am, Mason replied without hesitation. And I'm offering her a job at the Double Circle. We lost our cook last week, and the men are threatening mutiny over my biscuits. Josephine stared at the cowboy in surprise. Mr. Ironwood, you don't know anything about me. I know you handled Devil's Fury better than any horseman I've ever seen, Mason said, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. And I know I've got 20 hungry cowboys who'll ride out if they have to suffer through another week of my cooking. Sheriff Burke looked between them, his suspicion evident. Finally, he shrugged. Your funeral, Ironwood, but keep her out of town unless necessary. People here are superstitious enough without. He gestured vaguely at Josephine. As the sheriff walked away, Josephine turned to Mason. Why would you do that? Take responsibility for someone you don't know. Mason looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe I need a cook that badly. I never said I could cook. Can you? Josephine hesitated. Yes, but then there's no problem. Mason turned and began stroking the now calm stallion's neck. Besides, I've always had a soft spot for strays, both the 4-legged and 2-legged variety. I'm not a stray, Josephine said, bristling. Mason's eyes crinkled at the corners. No. Then where's home, Miss Ford? The question hung in the air between them. Josephine had no answer to give. Home had been a cabin in the Colorado mountains until the fever took her parents 5 years ago. Since then, home had been wherever she could find temporary peace. That's what I thought, Mason said, his voice gentler now. The Double Circle is 10 miles north of town. You can ride out with me after I finish my business here. Josephine should have refused. Getting entangled with people only led to pain when they inevitably discovered what she was. But the alternative was riding out of Park City with no destination in mind and the sheriff's suspicions dogging her trail. Thank you, she said finally. I'll accept your offer, Mr. Ironwood, but there's something you should know. Mason raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Josephine met his gaze directly. They say I'm touched by madness, she warned. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, then smiled a real smile that transformed his weathered face. Then I'll be mad with you, Miss Ford, he said, tipping his hat. Seems to me, a little madness might be just what the Double Circle needs. As Mason led the black stallion back to the livery stable, Josephine stood in the dusty street, wondering what kind of man would invite trouble so willingly into his life. Whatever his reasons, She knew one thing for certain: Mason Ironwood would regret his impulsive offer once he learned the truth about what she really was. But for now, she had a place to go. And for a woman who'd been running for 5 years, that was no small thing. The ride to the Double Circle Ranch was mostly silent. Mason had finished his business in town picking up mail and supplies, and they'd set out as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains. Josephine rode her mare, a steady sorrel she called Penny, while Mason handled the temperamental Devil's Fury with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. "Your horse," Josephine said, breaking the silence as they crested a hill that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. "How did he get such a name?" Mason chuckled. "Earned it fair and square. Broke 3 wranglers' bones and nearly killed my foreman before I decided to take him on myself." He patted the stallion's muscular neck. "Still has his moments, as you saw in town." "He's afraid," Josephine said without thinking. Mason glanced at her. "Of what? The animal fears nothing I've ever seen." Josephine hesitated, then decided there was little point in hiding this much of herself. "Of the fire. He remembers it." Mason reined his horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face her fully. "How could you possibly know that? Devil's Fury was caught in a stable fire as a colt, nearly died, but I never mentioned that." Josephine looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "Animals speak in their own way if you know how to listen. And you know how to listen." His tone wasn't mocking, merely curious. "Sometimes. It's not something I can explain." Mason was quiet for so long that Josephine finally looked back at him, expecting to see the familiar mixture of fear and suspicion she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, his expression was thoughtful. "My grandmother was Ute," he said finally. "She had what she called the knowing. Could predict storms days before they hit, knew when someone was sick before they showed symptoms." He urged his horse forward again. "People thought she was touched too." Josephine followed, a small flicker of hope kindling in her chest. "And what did you think?" "I thought she saved a lot of lives with her knowing," Mason replied simply. "Including mine." They rode in companionable silence after that, the landscape gradually changing from scrubby hills to well-maintained pastures. Cattle grazed on the lush grass, fat and content in the late summer bounty. Josephine could see why the Double Circle was prosperous. The land was good, with a creek winding through it providing water even in the driest months. As they approached the ranch proper, Josephine took in the sprawling main house, a 2-story structure of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings dotted the property: a bunkhouse, barn, smokehouse, and what appeared to be a small cottage set apart from the rest. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed. "My father built it," Mason replied, pride evident in his voice. "Started with nothing but a claim and 10 head of cattle. By the time he died, the Double Circle was the largest spread in the territory." His voice grew softer. "Lost my mother the same year. It's just been me since then." "I'm sorry," Josephine said. "I lost my parents to fever 5 years ago." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It leaves a hole that never quite fills, doesn't it?" Before Josephine could respond, they were spotted by the ranch hands, who called out greetings to Mason and curious looks at Josephine. A man with graying hair and a pronounced limp made his way toward them from the corral. "That's Samuel," Mason said. "My foreman and oldest friend. He'll show you the ropes while I get these supplies unpacked." Samuel approached, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Boss, you're back earlier than expected." His eyes shifted to Josephine. "And with company, I see." "Samuel, this is Miss Josephine Ford. She's our new cook," Mason said, dismounting. "Miss Ford, this is Samuel Green. He's been with the Double Circle longer than I have." Samuel tipped his hat. "Pleasure, madam. The boys will be mighty happy to hear we've got a real cook again. No offense to the boss, but his biscuits could double as horseshoes." Josephine smiled despite her nervousness. "None taken, I'm sure." "Miss Ford will be staying in the cook's cottage," Mason said, nodding toward the small structure Josephine had noticed. "Make sure it's cleaned up and ready for her." "Already had the boys air it out when you rode up," Samuel replied. "Figured you wouldn't be bringing a lady back to sleep in the bunkhouse." Mason shot him a warning look, but Samuel just grinned unrepentantly. "I'll show Miss Ford around while you deal with Devil's Fury," the foreman offered. "That beast actually looks somewhat civilized for once." "Miss Ford has a way with horses," Mason said, gathering the stallion's reins. "Devil's Fury practically ate out of her hand in town." Samuel's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Did he now? Well, Miss Ford, you've already impressed the most difficult resident of the double circle. The rest of us should be easy by comparison." As Mason led his horse toward the barn, Samuel offered to show Josephine to her cottage. They walked across the yard, and Josephine felt the stares of the cowboys who had paused in their work to watch her pass. "Don't mind them," Samuel said quietly. "We don't get many visitors out here, especially not young ladies. They'll settle down once the novelty wears off." "I'm used to being stared at," Josephine replied. Samuel gave her a sidelong glance. "I imagine you are, with those unusual eyes. Quite striking." The cottage was small but clean, with a comfortable bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove for heat. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and curtains framed the 2 windows. "It's lovely," Josephine said, genuinely pleased. After months of sleeping under the stars or in cheap boarding houses, the cottage seemed luxurious. "Mason's mother made that quilt," Samuel said, nodding toward the bed. "She was quite the seamstress." He paused, studying Josephine with kind eyes. "If you don't mind my asking, miss, how did you come to meet the boss?" Josephine hesitated, unsure how much Mason had planned to explain. "We met in town. I calmed his horse, and he offered me a job when he learned I could cook." Samuel nodded slowly. Mason's always had good instincts about people. Still, it's unusual for him to bring a stranger home, especially. He trailed off. "Especially a woman," Josephine finished for him. "Especially anyone," Samuel corrected. "Mason keeps to himself these days." "Has ever since he came back from the war." Josephine wanted to ask more, but Samuel was already moving toward the door. "The kitchen's in the main house. Breakfast is at 5, dinner at noon, and supper at 6. The hands work hard and eat accordingly," he smiled. "Any questions?" "No, thank you." "I'll find my way." Samuel paused at the door. "Miss Ford, I don't know what brought you to the double circle, but I hope you'll find what you're looking for here." With that cryptic statement, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Josephine sank onto the bed, running her hand over the colorful quilt. What was she looking for? Safety. A place to belong. Those seemed like impossible dreams for someone like her. Still, as she unpacked her meager belongings, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to stay in one place without fear. That evening, Josephine prepared her first meal for the ranch hands. The kitchen was well stocked, and she managed to put together a hearty supper of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple cobbler for dessert. The cowboys filed in, removing their hats and washing up before taking their places at the long table in the dining room. Mason sat at the head of the table with Samuel to his right. He gestured for Josephine to sit on his left, an honor that clearly surprised the men. She felt their curious gazes as she took her seat, but no one commented. "Miss Ford has graciously agreed to save us all from starvation," Mason announced with a smile. "So I expect you all to show your appreciation by minding your manners." A chorus of "yes, boss" went around the table, followed by appreciative murmurs as the food was passed. Josephine felt a small glow of pride as the men dug in with enthusiasm. "This is real cooking," declared a young cowboy with freckles scattered across his sunburned face. "Beats whatever the boss was trying to poison us with." There were chuckles around the table, and Mason took the ribbing good-naturedly. "Watch it, Tyler, or you'll find yourself on night watch for the next month." The meal progressed with easy banter among the men. They were curious about Josephine but respectful, asking where she'd learned to cook, my mother, and if she'd been out west long all my life. She carefully deflected more personal questions, and to her relief, no one pressed. After supper, Josephine began clearing the table, but Mason stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Leave the dishes for tonight," he said. "The boys will handle them. You've done enough for your first day." Josephine wanted to protest, but the truth was she felt exhausted. The emotional strain of the day had taken its toll, and the comfort of knowing she had a safe place to sleep tonight made her realize just how tired she really was. "Thank you," she said. "I think I will turn in early." Mason walked her to the door of the main house. The evening air had cooled and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound haunting and familiar. "Thank you for the meal," Mason said as they paused on the porch. "I haven't eaten that well since before our last cook left." "It was my pleasure," Josephine replied. "Your men seem like good people. They are, loyal and hardworking." Mason leaned against the porch railing, studying her in the fading light. "Can I ask you something, Miss Ford?" Josephine tensed but nodded. "What were you running from when you rode into Park City?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "What makes you think I was running?" Mason's expression was gentle but knowing. "I recognize the look. I've seen it in my own mirror." Josephine considered deflecting again, but found herself wanting to offer him at least a partial truth. "In the last town I stayed in, a child fell ill with fever. The doctor couldn't help him, but I knew what herbs might bring the fever down. When I tried to help, the boy's father accused me of witchcraft." She swallowed hard. "The boy recovered, but by then the rumors had spread. People can be frightened of what they don't understand." "And they don't understand you," Mason said softly. "It wasn't a question. No, they never have." Josephine looked out at the darkening ranch yard. "I should have left as soon as the child was better, but I stayed an extra day to make sure he was truly recovering. That was my mistake." "Caring isn't a mistake," Mason said firmly. Josephine smiled sadly. "It is when it gets you chased out of town with a mob at your heels." She straightened. "Thank you again for the job, Mr. Ironwood. I promise I won't bring trouble to your door." As she turned to go, Mason spoke again. "Miss Ford," she paused, looking back at him, "you're safe here." "I give you my word on that." Something in his voice, a quiet certainty, made Josephine believe him despite her better judgment. She nodded once, then made her way across the yard to her cottage, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way. Inside, she lit the lamp and prepared for bed, her mind whirling with the events of the day. Mason Ironwood was an enigma, a successful rancher who, according to his foreman, kept to himself, yet had unhesitatingly offered a job and sanctuary to a strange woman with blood on her sleeve and rumors at her back. As Josephine drifted toward sleep, she wondered what ghosts haunted the cowboy who had declared he'd be mad with her. She suspected his demons were every bit as persistent as her own. Days at the double circle fell into a rhythm as July melted into August. Josephine rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent the morning baking bread and planning the day's meals, served dinner at noon, then had a few hours to herself before preparing supper. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in years, She began to feel the tension in her shoulders ease. The cowboys had accepted her quickly, won over by her cooking and quiet demeanor. They treated her with a curious mix of respect and protective camaraderie, tipping their hats when she passed and offering to carry heavy items without making her feel helpless. Even Sheriff Burke's suspicions seemed to have been forgotten, as he tipped his hat politely when Josephine accompanied Samuel to town for supplies. Only Mason remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, even warm at times, but Josephine sensed he was holding something back. He ate with his men, worked alongside them during the day, and occasionally joined in their card games in the evening, but there was a distance to him, a wall that no one seemed able to breach. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Josephine was gathering herbs from the small garden she'd started behind her cottage when she heard the distinctive sound of Devil's Fury's hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see Mason riding toward her, the stallion's black coat gleaming in the sunlight. "Miss Ford," he called, reining in his horse. "I was wondering if you might be free for a ride. There's something I'd like to show you." Josephine shaded her eyes with her hand. "Now." "If you're not too busy," he said, suddenly looking uncertain. "The men are taking care of the evening chores, and Samuel knows how to heat up the stew you prepared." Curiosity piqued, Josephine nodded. "Let me change into my riding skirt." A few minutes later, she emerged from her cottage in a divided skirt that allowed her to ride astride. Mason had brought Penny, already saddled and waiting. "Where are we going?" she asked as they rode away from the ranch house. "There's a place up in the foothills I think you might appreciate," Mason replied. "It's about an hour's ride." They traveled in companionable silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the land. The air was fragrant with sage and pine, and Josephine found herself relaxing as they climbed higher into the hills. "How are you settling in?" Mason asked eventually, guiding his horse around a rocky outcropping. "Well, I think," Josephine replied, "your men have been kind. They respect you." "That's not kindness, just good sense." Mason glanced at her. "You've been good for the double circle. Morale is higher than I've seen it in years." Josephine felt herself flush at the compliment. "Good food can do that." "It's more than the food," Mason said quietly. "It's you. There's a calmness about you that affects everyone around you." Josephine wasn't sure how to respond to that. No one had ever described her presence as calming before. Usually, it was the opposite. Her difference made people uneasy. "Even me," Mason continued, surprising her further. "I've slept better since you arrived than I have in years." The personal admission hung in the air between them. Josephine studied his profile, noting the strong line of his jaw, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his eyes seemed to hold both strength and a deep sadness. "Why did you really hire me, Mr. Ironwood?" she asked finally. "And please don't say it was for my cooking." Mason was quiet for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "When I saw you in town that day, standing fearless before Devil's Fury, something just clicked into place. I can't explain it better than that." He glanced at her. "And then when the sheriff started in with his accusations, I saw the look in your eyes. Not fear exactly, but a bone-deep weariness, like you were tired of running but didn't know how to stop. And you recognized that look," Josephine said softly, remembering their conversation on the porch. Mason nodded. "I came back from the war with nightmares that wouldn't quit. Spent 3 years drifting, taking whatever jobs would keep me in whiskey money." His hands tightened on the reins. "I was running too, just in a different way." "What brought you back to the double circle?" "My father died," Mason said simply. "Samuel wrote to tell me." By then, I'd hit bottom, was sleeping in stables and taking on the kind of jobs decent men wouldn't touch. He took a deep breath. Coming home was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it saved my life. Josephine absorbed this, understanding now why the ranch meant so much to him. And you thought you could offer me the same lifeline. Everyone deserves a place where they can catch their breath, Mason said. Even those of us who are different. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Before Josephine could respond, Mason pointed ahead. We're here. They had reached a small plateau overlooking a hidden valley. A clear spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a small pool before cascading down the hillside in a series of miniature waterfalls. Around the pool grew a profusion of wildflowers and herbs, some of which Josephine recognized as medicinal. It's beautiful, she breathed, dismounting. My grandmother's place, Mason said, sliding from his horse. She used to come here to gather herbs and listen to the earth, as she called it. He gestured toward the plants. I thought you might find some of these useful. Josephine moved toward the pool, kneeling to examine the plants that grew there. She recognized yarrow, wild mint, echinacea, and several others that she used in her healing work. These are perfect, she said, looking up at Mason with genuine gratitude. How did you know? Mason shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. I've seen the herbs you've been drying, figured you might be running low on some of them. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Josephine deeply. This wasn't just about providing her with medicinal herbs. It was Mason's way of telling her that he accepted her, all of her, including the parts that made others fear her. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. This means more than I can say. Mason nodded, then settled on a boulder near the spring while Josephine gathered what she needed, placing the herbs carefully in the leather satchel he had brought for that purpose. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson when she finally finished. We should head back, Mason said, though he made no move to rise. It'll be dark soon. Josephine sat beside him on the boulder, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. Can I ask you something, Mr. Ironwood? I think after everything you might call me Mason, he said with a small smile. Mason, she amended. That day in town when I warned you about what people say about me, why did you respond the way you did? Mason was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Because I know what it's like to be seen as damaged or dangerous. He turned to look at her directly. After the war, people looked at me like I might shatter or explode at any moment. They weren't entirely wrong. And now, Josephine asked softly. Now I'm just the odd rancher who keeps to himself, he said with a wry smile. But the war left its mark. I still have nights when I wake up fighting enemies who aren't there. His eyes held hers. So when you warned me about your supposed madness, it didn't frighten me. Whatever demons you're wrestling with, they can't be worse than the ones I've already faced. In the fading light, with the scent of sage and wildflowers in the air and the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks, Josephine felt something inside her shift. Here was someone who didn't fear her difference but seemed to value it, perhaps even understand it. I see things sometimes, she said abruptly. Not just animals' fears or memories, but other things, things that haven't happened yet. Mason's expression remained unchanged. Like your grandmother's knowing, similar but stronger, I think, and less controllable. Josephine looked down at her hands. It started after my parents died. At first I thought it was grief playing tricks on my mind, but then the visions began coming true. She swallowed hard. People don't like having their futures told, especially when the news isn't good. Is that why you were run out of that last town? Because you foresaw something? Josephine nodded. I saw the fever before it struck, tried to warn them, but no one would listen. By the time the first children fell ill, People were already blaming me for bringing the sickness. Her voice grew bitter. As if I would harm innocent children. People fear what they don't understand, Mason said, echoing her own words from weeks before. And fear makes them stupid and cruel. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky and the stars emerged in all their glory. Finally, Mason stood and offered Josephine his hand. "We should get back," he said. "But Josephine—" He paused, using her given name for the first time. "I meant what I said that day. Your visions, your healing, whatever gifts you have, they don't frighten me. If that's madness, then I'll gladly share in it." Josephine took his offered hand, feeling calluses against her palm and an unexpected warmth that seemed to travel up her arm. As Mason helped her onto her mare, their eyes met briefly in the starlight, and Josephine felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or wariness. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if she might have found not just a temporary haven, but something more lasting. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought as they made their way down the moonlit trail. When they reached the double circle, the windows of the main house glowed with lamplight, and the sound of men's laughter drifted from the bunkhouse. Mason helped Josephine dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said, his voice low in the darkness. "Thank you for showing me your grandmother's place," she replied. "And for listening." He nodded, then led both horses toward the barn. Josephine watched him go, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Hope, fear, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. As she turned toward her cottage, she noticed Samuel sitting on the porch of the main house, his pipe glowing in the darkness. "Evening, Miss Ford," he called softly. "Had a nice ride?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, approaching the porch. "Mason showed me a lovely spot in the foothills." Samuel's eyebrows rose at her use of the rancher's given name, but he made no comment on it. "His grandmother's herb garden," he said instead. "He hasn't taken anyone there since he came back from the war." Josephine wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. Samuel studied her for a moment, then tapped his pipe against the porch railing. "The boss has been different since you arrived," he said finally. "More like his old self." "I don't see how I could have had any effect on him," Josephine said, suddenly uncomfortable with the conversation. Samuel chuckled. "Don't you? Mason was always a good man, but after the war something in him went cold. He did what needed doing, took care of his people, but it was like he was just going through the motions." The old foreman's eyes were kind in the lamplight. "Until you showed up and calmed that demon horse of his." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "I think you're reading too much into a simple coincidence." "Maybe so," Samuel agreed easily. "But I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Haven't seen him smile this much in years." He stood with a grunt, knees cracking. "Just something to think about, Miss Ford." "Good night now." "Good night, Samuel," Josephine replied, watching as he made his way into the house. Alone on the porch, she looked up at the vast sweep of stars above the ranch. For years, she'd convinced herself that her path was meant to be walked alone, that her differences made connection too dangerous, too painful. Now, for the first time, she wondered if that was really true. With a sigh, she headed for her cottage, the satchel of herbs a comforting weight against her side and Samuel's words echoing in her mind. As August gave way to September, life at the double circle continued its steady rhythm, but with subtle changes that only someone paying close attention might notice. Mason began taking his evening meals on the porch of the main house, inviting Josephine to join him after the cowboys had been fed. These quiet dinners became a ritual, a time when they would talk about everything and nothing: the day's work, books they had read, memories of their childhoods. Josephine found herself looking forward to these conversations, to the way Mason listened intently to whatever she had to say, his gray eyes focused entirely on her. He never flinched when she mentioned her visions or healing work, never showed the wariness that had become so familiar in others' expressions. One evening in mid-September, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mason asked, "Have you had any visions since you've been here?" Josephine hesitated, then nodded. "Small ones, nothing significant." "What do you see?" "Fragments, mostly. Weather changes, minor accidents before they happen." She smiled slightly. "I knew Tyler was going to fall off that new colt 3 days before it happened." Mason chuckled. "Did you warn him?" "Would he have listened?" "Probably not," Mason conceded. "That boy has more confidence than sense sometimes." A comfortable silence fell between them as the last light faded from the sky. In the distance, a coyote called, and soon others joined in, their eerie chorus rising toward the emerging stars. "I had a vision about you," Josephine said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "The night before I rode into Park City." Mason turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "What did you see?" Josephine took a deep breath. "I saw a man with storm-gray eyes standing between me and danger. I saw safety." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't believe it. I've learned not to trust in safety." Mason was quiet for so long that Josephine began to regret her words. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, "I'm glad your vision brought you here." Before she could respond, he stood and offered her his hand. "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." Curious, Josephine allowed him to lead her into the main house and up the stairs to a room she had never entered, his private study. It was a comfortable space, with bookshelves lining one wall, a large desk near the window, and a stone fireplace along another wall. Mason lit a lamp, casting a warm glow over the room. "My father built this house with the idea that it would be filled with family," he said, moving to a cabinet near the fireplace. "He and my mother had hoped for many children, but after I was born there were complications. She couldn't have more." He opened the cabinet and removed something, holding it carefully in his hands. "My mother used to say that family isn't always about blood." He turned and handed Josephine a small, leather-bound book. "This was my grandmother's. Her medicine book, she called it. I thought you might find it useful." Josephine opened the book with reverent hands. Inside were carefully documented medicinal recipes, drawings of herbs, and notations about treatments for various ailments. But there was more passages about dreams and visions, about the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. "Mason, this is." She looked up at him, unable to find the words. "I know," he said simply. "She would have wanted you to have it. The knowledge shouldn't be lost." Josephine ran her fingers over the yellowed pages, overwhelmed by the gift. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it." Mason moved closer, his eyes intent on her face. "Josephine," he said, her name like a caress on his lips, "I've been wanting to ask you something." Her heart began to beat faster at his proximity, at the warmth in his voice. "Yes. The Harvest Festival is coming up in Park City. I was wondering if you would accompany me." The request was so unexpected, so normal, that Josephine almost laughed. After everything, her visions, his war demons, the strangeness that had brought them together, he was asking her to a town festival, like any ordinary man might ask any ordinary woman. "You want to be seen with me?" "In town?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Mason's brow furrowed. "Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?" "Because people talk, Mason. They already whisper about the strange woman with the mismatched eyes who lives at the Double Circle." "Let them talk," he said firmly. "I don't give a damn what anyone thinks except you." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "So, will you come with me?" Looking up at him, at the open honesty in his face and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him, Josephine found she couldn't refuse. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that." A smile broke across Mason's face, transforming his features in a way that made Josephine's breath catch. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palm. Mason's smile faded, replaced by something deeper, more intense. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Josephine had been kissed before, awkward fumblings in her youth before her strangeness had become apparent. But this was different. Mason's kiss was tender yet confident, asking rather than demanding. When he began to pull away, Josephine found herself rising on her toes to follow his mouth, prolonging the contact. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you calmed my horse," he admitted. Josephine smiled, feeling a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "That long, longer it seems," he said, "as if I'd been waiting for you before I even knew you existed." The words might have sounded like a line from a dime novel romance if not for the raw sincerity in Mason's voice. Josephine found herself believing him, despite all the hard lessons life had taught her about trust and hope. "I should go," she said reluctantly, stepping back. "It's getting late." Mason nodded, though his eyes said he wished she would stay. "I'll walk you back to your cottage." The night air was cool as they crossed the yard, the stars brilliant overhead. They walked close enough that their hands brushed occasionally, sending little thrills up Josephine's arm each time it happened. At the door to her cottage, Mason kissed her again, more firmly this time, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck. Josephine found herself melting against him, the leather-bound book clutched to her chest like a shield between them. "Good night, Josephine," he murmured when they parted. "Good night, Mason," she replied, her voice unsteady. Inside her cottage, Josephine leaned against the closed door, her heart racing. What was she doing? Getting involved with Mason could only complicate things, make it harder when the time inevitably came for her to move on. Because that time would come, it always did. Yet as she readied for bed, the memory of his kiss lingered, warm and promising. And for the first time in years, Josephine allowed herself to dream of a future that wasn't defined by running and fear, a future where she might belong somewhere, with someone who saw her difference not as a curse, but as a gift. The Park City Harvest Festival was held on the last Saturday of September, when the aspen trees on the surrounding mountains had turned to gold, and the air held the first crisp promise of autumn. The entire town turned out for the celebration, with booths selling food and handicrafts lining the main street, a dance floor set up in the town square, and competitions ranging from pie baking to horseshoe throwing. Josephine had spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, changing her dress 3 times before settling on a deep blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes. It was one of the few fine things she still possessed from her life before, carefully preserved and rarely worn. When Mason arrived at her cottage to escort her to town, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Josephine felt herself blush. Mason looked handsome as well, having traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and pressed trousers. His hair was neatly combed, though a few strands had already escaped to fall across his forehead. "You clean up nicely yourself," she said with a smile. They rode to town in the ranch's best wagon, with several of the cowboys following behind on horseback, all eager for a day of festivities. The streets of Park City were already crowded when they arrived, with families strolling among the booths and the sound of a fiddle drifting from the square. As they made their way through the crowd, Josephine was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Mason either didn't notice or chose to ignore them, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back as he guided her through the throng. "Mason Ironwood," a booming voice called out. "About time you showed your face in town for something other than supplies." A large man with a prosperous belly and an expensive suit approached, hand extended. Mason shook it with a polite smile. "Judge Harmon, good to see you." "And who is this lovely lady?" the judge asked, turning to Josephine with undisguised curiosity. "Josephine Ford," Mason said. "She's the new cook at the Double Circle. Josephine, this is Judge William Harmon, one of Park City's founding fathers." "Miss Ford," the judge said, taking her hand. "A pleasure. Though I must say, Mason, you've been keeping your new employee rather quiet. We've hardly seen her in town." There was something in his tone that made Josephine stiffen, but Mason's reply was easy and untroubled. "Miss Ford has been busy making sure my men don't starve to death. And I've been keeping her busy with riding lessons as well." The judge's eyebrows rose. "Riding lessons? Miss Ford has a remarkable way with horses," Mason said, his tone leaving no room for the innuendo the judge seemed to be implying. "In fact, she's the only person besides me who can handle Devil's Fury without getting thrown." Judge Harmon looked impressed despite himself. "That devil horse of yours. Well, that is something." He turned back to Josephine. "You must have quite the touch, Miss Ford." "She does," Mason agreed before Josephine could respond. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Judge, I promised Miss Ford some apple cider from Mrs. Patterson's booth." As they moved away, Josephine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she murmured. Mason squeezed her hand. "For what?" "For not letting him make me feel like I don't belong here." Mason stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious. "You do belong, Josephine, right here with me." His voice dropped so that only she could hear. "And anyone who can't see that isn't worth your concern." The conviction in his words warmed her, and Josephine felt some of her tension ease. They continued through the festival, stopping to sample treats from the food booths and to admire the handiwork at the craft displays. Mason seemed to know everyone, introducing Josephine with such natural pride that many of the townspeople began to warm to her despite their initial wariness. By mid-afternoon, when the dancing began in the square, Josephine was actually enjoying herself. She watched as couples took to the wooden dance floor, swinging to the lively tunes played by a small band of local musicians. "Dance with me?" Mason asked, offering his hand. Josephine hesitated. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," he admitted. "But I think we can manage not to step on each other's toes too badly." With a laugh, Josephine allowed him to lead her onto the floor. The band was playing a waltz, and Mason swept her into his arms with surprising grace. They moved together as if they had danced 100 times before, her skirts swirling around their legs as he guided her through the steps. "You lied," Josephine accused playfully. "You've definitely danced before." Mason grinned. "My mother insisted I learn. Said no son of hers was going to embarrass her at social functions by clomping around like a draft horse." Josephine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. For a few precious minutes, as they twirled among the other dancers, she forgot about the stares and whispers, forgot about her visions and the fear they inspired in others. She was just a woman dancing with a man who looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. The spell was broken by a commotion at the edge of the square. Josephine felt at first a wave of fear and anger that hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled, and Mason steadied her with concern in his eyes. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," she said, scanning the crowd. A group of men had gathered near the entrance to the square, their voices raised in anger. At their center stood Sheriff Burke, his hand on his gun belt as he faced down what appeared to be a mob led by a red-faced man Josephine had never seen before. "That's her," the man shouted, pointing directly at Josephine. "The witch who killed my boy." The music stopped abruptly, and a hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned toward Josephine and Mason. "What the hell?" Mason muttered, his arm instinctively tightening around Josephine's waist. Sheriff Burke approached, his expression grim. "Miss Ford, this man claims you're wanted in Silverton for the death of his son. Says you gave the boy some kind of potion that poisoned him." "That's a lie," Josephine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've never been to Silverton." "Liar," the red-faced man shouted. "I'd recognize those devil eyes anywhere. She came to our house, said she could cure my boy's cough. By morning he was dead." The crowd began to murmur, and Josephine could feel the mood shifting, the old familiar fear and suspicion rising like a tide around her. Mason stepped forward, placing himself between Josephine and her accuser. "Sheriff, this is absurd. Miss Ford has been at the Double Circle for nearly 2 months. She couldn't possibly have been in Silverton recently." "The boy died 3 months ago," the man spat. "She ran before we could catch her." 3 months ago, Miss Ford was working at the Hudson place over in Green River," Mason countered. "Mrs. Hudson can confirm it. I hired Miss Ford from there." Josephine stared at Mason in surprise. She had never told him where she'd been before Park City. Sheriff Burke's eyes narrowed. "Is that so, Ironwood?" "It is," Mason said firmly. "And I'll ride to Green River myself to get Mrs. Hudson's statement if needed." The sheriff looked between Mason and the angry stranger, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "Mr. Blackstone, unless you have actual proof that Miss Ford was in Silverton and had something to do with your son's death, I can't arrest her on your say-so. Especially not with Mr. Ironwood vouching for her whereabouts." "She's bewitched him," Blackstone shouted. "Look at him, defending a witch. Everyone knows the Ironwood boy hasn't let a woman near him since he came back from the war, and suddenly he's dancing with this creature." A muscle ticked in Mason's jaw, but his voice remained controlled. "I'd watch your words, Mr. Blackstone. Miss Ford is under my protection, and I don't take kindly to false accusations against anyone associated with the Double Circle." The implicit threat in Mason's words wasn't lost on the crowd. The Double Circle was the largest employer in the area, and Mason Ironwood, for all his reclusiveness, was respected and even feared by some. Sheriff Burke placed a hand on Blackstone's shoulder. "I think you've had enough excitement for one day, friend. Why don't you come back to my office and we can discuss this matter civilly?" Blackstone shrugged off the sheriff's hand. "This isn't over," he growled, his hateful gaze fixed on Josephine. "Justice will be done one way or another." With that, he turned and stalked away, followed by a few of the men who had accompanied him. As the sheriff followed, the crowd began to disperse, but the damage was done. The festive mood had evaporated, replaced by whispers and sidelong glances. Mason turned to Josephine, concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she felt anything but all right. "I think we should leave." "Of course," Mason agreed. He kept his arm around her as they made their way back to where they had left the wagon, shielding her from the curious stares as best he could. The ride back to the ranch was silent, Josephine lost in troubled thoughts. She had known this day would come, it always did. The accusations, the fear, the inevitable need to flee. Only this time, The thought of leaving brought a sharp pain to her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the man sitting beside her. As they approached the double circle, Mason finally broke the silence. "You've never been to Silverton, have you?" "No," Josephine replied softly. "I've never even been close to it." Mason nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "I didn't think so. You lied to the sheriff," she said, "about me working at the Hudson place." "I did," he admitted without a trace of remorse. "Would you rather I had let that man continue his accusations?" "No, but—" Josephine hesitated. "You put yourself at risk, Mason. If the sheriff checks your story, he won't," Mason said confidently. "Burke knows me well enough to take my word. Besides, Green River is 3 days' ride from here. By the time anyone could verify the story, Blackstone will have moved on." Josephine wasn't so sure. She had seen the hatred in the man's eyes, a grief-fueled rage that wouldn't be easily appeased. "He believes I killed his son." "But you didn't," Mason said firmly. "And I won't let him or anyone else harm you based on a mistaken identity, or more likely, a deliberate attempt to find a scapegoat for a tragedy." Josephine looked at his profile, at the determined set of his jaw and the protective fire in his eyes. She had never had anyone stand up for her the way Mason had today, not since her parents died. The realization brought a lump to her throat. "Thank you," she said simply. Knowing the words were inadequate, Mason glanced at her, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me for doing what any decent man would do." "But that's just it," Josephine said. "Most men wouldn't have done what you did. They would have stepped away, let the accusations stand rather than risk association with someone like me." Mason reined in the horses, stopping the wagon before they reached the ranch yard. He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Josephine," he said, his voice low and intense. "I don't give a damn what people think of me. I haven't for a long time. But I do care about you more than I thought possible." His grip tightened. "And I'm not going to let some stranger's unfounded accusations drive you away from the double circle, from me." The raw emotion in his voice left Josephine breathless. She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and a depth of feeling that both thrilled and terrified her. "Mason," she whispered, "you don't know what you're getting into. People like that man, they don't give up easily. And the more you defend me, the more they'll turn against you too." "Let them try," he said with quiet certainty. Then gentler, "Josephine, I know you're used to running. I understand why you've had to, but I'm asking you to stay. Fight this with me. Trust that we can face whatever comes together. The word resonated in her heart, a promise she had never dared to believe could be hers. Looking at Mason, at the strength and kindness in his face, at the unwavering support he offered, Josephine found herself wanting to believe. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, for now." Relief washed over Mason's features, followed by a smile that made her heart skip. "That's all I'm asking," he said. Then, as if unable to help himself, he leaned forward and kissed her, a brief but fervent press of lips that sealed their agreement more effectively than words ever could. When they pulled apart, Josephine felt steadier, more resolved. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. For the first time in her adult life, she had someone willing to stand beside her, someone who saw her difference not as a flaw to be feared, but as a part of who she was. As they continued toward the ranch, the sun setting behind the mountains in a blaze of golden light, Josephine allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally found a place where she could stop running. The confrontation at the festival cast a shadow over the following days. Josephine found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, scanning the horizon whenever she ventured outside the ranch yard. Mason tried to ease her fears, assuring her that Blackstone would soon move on, but Josephine couldn't shake the feeling that danger was approaching. 3 days after the festival, Her premonition proved correct. Josephine was in the kitchen, preparing the midday meal, when a vision struck with such force that she dropped the knife she was holding. It clattered to the floor as images flooded her mind: riders approaching the double circle, guns drawn, Mason bleeding on the ground, flames consuming the barn. "No," she gasped, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. "Miss Ford." Samuel's concerned voice broke through the vision. "Are you all right?" Josephine blinked, the kitchen coming back into focus. Samuel stood in the doorway, his weathered face creased with worry. "Where's Mason?" she asked urgently. "Out checking the north pasture fence with some of the boys. Won't be back till supper." "Why, what's wrong?" Josephine hesitated only briefly. Samuel had been kind to her from the beginning, and she trusted his loyalty to Mason. "They're coming," she said. "Blackstone and others, armed, I saw it." To his credit, Samuel didn't question how she knew. "When?" "Soon, today." Josephine moved toward the window, scanning the horizon. "They mean to hurt Mason, to burn the ranch." Samuel's expression hardened. "Not while I'm breathing, they won't." He turned toward the door. "I'll get the men together, send someone to fetch the boss." "There isn't time," Josephine said, the certainty in her voice stopping Samuel in his tracks. "We need to prepare now." The old foreman studied her face, then nodded sharply. "What do you need me to do?" For the next hour, Josephine and Samuel worked quickly, gathering the remaining ranch hands, distributing weapons, and positioning men strategically around the property. Some of the cowboys were clearly skeptical of Josephine's warning, but their respect for Samuel kept them from questioning openly. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Josephine felt the familiar pressure building behind her eyes, the sense of impending danger growing stronger by the minute. She paced the front porch of the main house, scanning the road that led from town. "They're coming," she said softly as Samuel joined her. 6 men, including Blackstone. Samuel peered in the direction she was looking. "I don't see anything yet." "You will," Josephine assured him. "And Samuel, Mason is riding back. I can feel him approaching from the north. We have to keep him from being caught in the open." Samuel gave her a long look, then nodded. "Tyler," he called to the youngest cowboy, who was positioned near the barn, "ride out the back way, circle around to the north pasture. Find the boss and tell him to approach from the east, through the timber. Tell him we've got trouble coming." Tyler nodded and sprinted for his horse, disappearing behind the barn just as the first riders appeared on the horizon, exactly where Josephine had been watching. "There they are," Samuel muttered. "Just like you said." Josephine swallowed hard, recognizing Blackstone at the head of the group. Even at this distance, she could feel the malevolence radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Get inside," Samuel ordered, his hand moving to his gun. "If there's shooting, stay down." "No," Josephine said firmly. "This is about me. I won't hide while others face danger on my behalf." Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The riders were approaching rapidly, and Josephine could now make out the rifles they carried. "At least stay behind me," Samuel growled, positioning himself in front of her on the porch. The riders thundered into the yard, pulling their horses to a halt in a cloud of dust. Blackstone's face was flushed with anger, his eyes wild as they fixed on Josephine. "Where is she?" he shouted. "Where's the witch, Mr. Blackstone?" Samuel called, his voice calm despite the tension. "This is private property. State your business or ride on." "My business is with her," Blackstone spat, pointing at Josephine. "She killed my boy and she'll answer for it." "Miss Ford has done nothing wrong," Samuel replied steadily. "And as I said, this is private property. You and your friends need to leave." One of the men with Blackstone, a mean-looking individual with a scar running down one cheek, reached for his rifle. "We ain't leaving without the witch." Samuel's hand moved to his gun. "Then I'm afraid we have a problem." Josephine could feel the situation spiraling toward violence. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and she knew that in moments blood would be spilled. Without thinking, she stepped forward, moving past Samuel despite his attempt to hold her back. "Mr. Blackstone," she called, her voice clear and steady. "I understand your grief. Losing a child is a pain no parent should have to bear." Blackstone's face contorted with rage. "Don't you dare speak of my son. I am not the woman who came to your home in Silverton," Josephine continued, holding his gaze. "I have never been to Silverton and I have never harmed a child, but I understand why you want someone to blame for your loss." "Liar!" Blackstone roared, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. "The woman you're looking for has a scar across her face," Josephine said, recalling what Mason had told the sheriff. "I have no such mark. And 3 months ago, when your son died, I was working at a ranch in Green River, as Mr. Ironwood told the sheriff." The scarred man snorted. "Ironwood would say anything to protect his witch." "Would he lie to protect someone who killed a child?" Josephine asked quietly. "Would any decent man?" Before anyone could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the east. Josephine felt her heart lurch as Mason rode into the yard, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. Tyler followed close behind, looking anxious. "What the hell is going on here?" Mason demanded, dismounting in one fluid motion and striding toward the group. "Ironwood," Blackstone acknowledged, his tone hostile. "We've come for the witch." "Get off my property, Blackstone," Mason said, his voice dangerously soft. "Now." "Not without her," Blackstone insisted, though some of his bluster had faded in the face of Mason's cold anger. "Miss Ford isn't going anywhere," Mason replied. "And neither are you until Sheriff Burke arrives." As if on cue, more riders appeared on the road from town. Sheriff Burke and 2 deputies, moving at a swift trot. "I sent for the sheriff as soon as we spotted trouble," Samuel murmured to Josephine. "Figured this needed official handling." The arrival of the law seemed to take some of the fight out of Blackstone and his companions. They shifted uneasily in their saddles, exchanging glances as the sheriff approached. "What's all this?" Burke demanded, looking from Blackstone to Mason. "Got reports you were headed out here with trouble in mind, Blackstone." "Just seeking justice for my boy, Sheriff," Blackstone replied, though his voice lacked conviction now. "By threatening innocent people on private property." The sheriff shook his head. "That's not justice, that's vigilante nonsense." "She's the one," Blackstone insisted, pointing at Josephine. "The witch who poisoned my son." Sheriff Burke sighed heavily. "Mr. Blackstone, I've been making inquiries since our meeting at the festival. I received a telegraph this morning from the sheriff in Silverton." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "According to Sheriff Williams, the woman suspected in your son's death is described as 40 to 50 years of age, with gray streaked black hair and a pronounced scar running from her right eye to her jaw." Burke looked pointedly at Josephine. "Does Miss Ford match that description?" Blackstone's face flushed darker. "She's disguised herself, changed her appearance. In 3 months, she's made herself younger by 20 years and erased a prominent facial scar." Burke's tone was skeptical. "And according to this, the woman they're seeking goes by the name of Madame Zelda. Not Josephine Ford." The tension in the air began to dissipate as Blackstone's companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was becoming clear even to them that they had targeted the wrong woman. Mason moved to stand beside Josephine, his presence solid and reassuring. "I think we've established that Miss Ford is not the person you're looking for, Mr. Blackstone," he said quietly. "And I'm willing to overlook this intrusion on my property, given your grief. But if you ever threaten Miss Ford or anyone at the Double Circle again, I won't be so forgiving." Blackstone looked between Mason, Sheriff Burke, and Josephine, his anger visibly deflating as the reality of his mistake sank in. "I just wanted justice for my boy," he said, his voice breaking. "I understand," Josephine said softly, "and I'm truly sorry for your loss. But I'm not the one who harmed your son." For a moment, something like recognition flickered in Blackstone's eyes, not of Josephine as his son's killer, but perhaps of the genuine compassion in her voice. Then he looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I think it's time you headed back to town, Blackstone," Sheriff Burke said, his tone gentler now. "Let the law handle the search for this Madame Zelda." Blackstone nodded jerkily, then turned his horse without another word. His companions followed, casting uncertain glances over their shoulders as they rode away. The sheriff waited until they were out of earshot before turning to Mason and Josephine. "I apologize for the trouble," he said. "Blackstone arrived in town a few days ago, consumed with grief and anger. Been stirring up sentiment against Miss Ford since the festival." He glanced at Josephine. "For what it's worth, I never believed you were the woman he was describing. Just didn't have the proof until that telegraph came in this morning." "Thank you, Sheriff," Mason said, his hand finding Josephine's and squeezing gently. As Burke and his deputies departed, following Blackstone's group at a distance, the tension at the double circle gradually eased. The cowboys returned to their duties, and Samuel headed to the bunkhouse to assure everyone that the danger had passed. Mason led Josephine to the porch of the main house, where they sat side by side on the steps. For a long moment, neither spoke, both processing the events of the day. "You knew they were coming," Mason said finally, not a question but a statement of fact. Josephine nodded. "I had a vision. I saw them attacking the ranch, saw you." She couldn't bring herself to describe the image of Mason bleeding on the ground. "And you organized the defense," he continued, a note of admiration in his voice. "Samuel told me how you positioned the men, how certain you were about where the attack would come from." "I couldn't let them hurt you," Josephine said simply. "Not when I could prevent it." Mason turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Do you understand what happened today, Josephine?" She looked at him questioningly. "Your vision, your madness, as you once called it, saved lives." His eyes were intense, boring into hers, including, quite possibly, mine. Josephine hadn't thought of it that way. For so long, her visions had been a source of fear and rejection, a reason to be hated and hunted. The idea that they could be a force for protection, for good, was almost foreign to her. "I've spent years believing my abilities were a curse," she said softly. "Something to hide, to be ashamed of." "They're not," Mason said firmly. "They're a gift, one that many would envy if they weren't too afraid to understand." He released one of her hands to touch her face gently. "You saved my ranch today, my people, me." The tenderness in his touch, the certainty in his voice, broke something open inside Josephine, a dam that had held back years of pain and loneliness. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Josephine," Mason murmured, gathering her into his arms. "Sweetheart, don't cry." But she couldn't stop, years of pent-up emotion pouring out as she clung to him. Mason held her, his strong arms encircling her, one hand stroking her hair as he murmured soothing words against her temple. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Josephine felt drained but somehow lighter, as if a burden she had carried for too long had finally been set down. "I'm sorry," she said, pulling back slightly to wipe at her tear-stained face. "I don't usually." "Don't apologize," Mason interrupted gently. "Not for feeling. Not with me." Looking up at him, at the warmth and acceptance in his eyes, Josephine felt the last of her defenses crumbling. She had spent so long protecting herself, keeping people at a distance to avoid the inevitable pain of rejection. But here was a man who had faced down armed men for her, who called her abilities a gift when others named them madness, who held her while she cried and asked nothing more than to be allowed to comfort her. "Mason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Josephine feared she had said too much, too soon. Then Mason's face broke into a smile so radiant it took her breath away. "Josephine Ford," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I fell in love with you the moment you calmed my horse and warned me you were touched by madness." He cupped her face in his hands. "And I'll spend every day for the rest of my life being mad with you if you'll let me." His kiss was gentle at first, a question she answered by winding her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. Then it deepened, becoming something more urgent, more powerful, a promise of all they could be together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Not just at the double circle, but with me. Be my wife, Josephine." The proposal, so unexpected yet so right, brought fresh tears to Josephine's eyes. But these were tears of joy, of a happiness so overwhelming it could only express itself through emotion. "Yes," she said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes, I'll stay with you. I'll be your wife, Mason Ironwood." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard of the double circle, Mason kissed her again, sealing their promise as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. And for the first time in her life, Josephine felt the certainty of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the right person. The future stretched before them, unknown, but faced together her visions, his nightmares, their love strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The wedding was held at the double circle on a crisp October morning, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the blue sky and the first dusting of snow on the distant peaks. It was a small ceremony, attended by the ranch hands, a few trusted friends from town, and to Josephine's surprise, Judge Harmon, who performed the service with unexpected warmth. Sheriff Burke came too, bringing news that Blackstone had left the territory, heading east to stay with his sister in Missouri. The sheriff also brought a wedding gift, a letter from the sheriff in Silverton, confirming that the real Madame Zelda had been apprehended in Denver, confessing to several instances of fraud, and one case of accidental poisoning involving a young boy whose parents had sought her healing services. "Thought you might want to know," Burke said gruffly as he handed the letter to Josephine. "Clear your name officially, so to speak." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, touched by the gesture. "That means a great deal to me." The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Mason had asked Samuel to stand as his best man, while Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife who had become a friend to Josephine in recent weeks, served as her matron of honor. Josephine wore a cream-colored dress ordered specially from Salt Lake City, with lace at the collar and cuffs, and her dark hair was adorned with small white flowers that Mrs. Patterson had helped arrange. When Mason saw her walking toward him across the ranch yard, his face transformed with such naked adoration that several of the tough cowboys looked away, embarrassed by the raw emotion on display. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Mason whispered when she reached him. "Even more beautiful than Devil's Fury," she teased, her eyes dancing. Mason laughed, the sound joyous and free. "Even more beautiful than Devil's Fury," he confirmed. "Though don't tell him that, he's vain enough as it is." Their vows were traditional, but spoken with a depth of feeling that moved even the most hardened of the ranch hands. When Judge Harmon pronounced them husband and wife, and Mason kissed his bride, a cheer went up that could probably be heard all the way in Park City. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and drink flowing freely. Music provided by several cowboys who proved surprisingly talented on various instruments, and dancing under the stars. Josephine found herself passed from partner to partner, as the ranch hands each claimed a dance with the new Mrs. Ironwood, their initial wariness of her long since replaced by protective affection. But it was Mason she returned to again and again, drawn to his side like a compass needle to true north. And each time she did, he welcomed her with a smile that made her heart skip, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. As the festivities wound down and the last of the guests departed or retired to the bunkhouse, Mason led Josephine not to the cottage she had occupied these past months, but to the main house, to the master bedroom that had stood empty since his parents' deaths. "I had Samuel and some of the boys move your things," he explained as he opened the door, revealing a room transformed. New curtains hung at the windows, the old furniture had been polished to a warm glow, and fresh flowers stood in a vase on the bedside table. "I hope you don't mind." "It's perfect," Josephine said, touched by the care he had taken to make the space welcoming for her. Mason closed the door behind them, suddenly looking almost shy. "It's been a long time since this room was used," he said. "A long time since this house felt like a home." Josephine moved to him, placing her hands on his chest. "Then we'll make it a home again," she promised. "Together." Mason's eyes darkened as he looked down at her. "Together," he echoed, his voice dropping to a husky whisper that sent shivers down Josephine's spine. Their first night as husband and wife was both tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them breathless and marveling at the depth of their connection. And as they lay entwined in the quiet hours before dawn, Josephine felt a peace she had never known, a sense of rightness, of having finally found her place in the world. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Josephine smiled in the darkness. "I was thinking about the day we met, about what you said when I warned you about my supposed madness." Mason chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "That I'd be mad with you. Yes." She propped herself up on one elbow to look down at his face, silvered by the moonlight streaming through the window. "Did you mean it even then, or was it just something to say?" Mason reached up to touch her face, his expression serious now. "I meant it," he said quietly. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew there was something different about you, something special, and I knew I wanted to be part of it, whatever it was." Josephine turned her head to press a kiss to his palm. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," she whispered. "A home, acceptance, love, and you've given me back my life," Mason replied, pulling her down for a gentle kiss. "A reason to live, not just exist." He smiled against her lips. "And a lot of very satisfied cowboys who were about to mutiny over my cooking." Josephine laughed, snuggling back against his side as his arms came around her. "That too," she agreed. As sleep began to claim them, Josephine found herself thinking not of the past, with all its pain and loneliness, but of the future, a future bright with possibility, rich with love, and shared with a man who saw her gift as a blessing rather than a curse. The years that followed were the happiest of Josephine's life. The double circle prospered under Mason's management, becoming one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Josephine's garden expanded to include a wide variety of medicinal herbs, and gradually, cautiously, she began to use her knowledge to help others. At first, it was just the ranch hands and their families, then neighbors in need, and eventually, people from Park City itself. Her visions continued, but now she had Mason to share them with, to help interpret their meaning and, when possible, use the foreknowledge to prevent harm. Together, They saved the ranch from a flash flood by moving cattle to higher ground the day before it struck, warned a neighboring homestead of an impending wildfire, and even helped locate a child who had wandered away from a town picnic. Slowly, the fear that had once surrounded Josephine's abilities transformed into respect and even gratitude. People still whispered about the strange Mrs. Ironwood with her mismatched eyes, but now those whispers held awe rather than suspicion. 2 years after their wedding, in the spring of 1878, Josephine gave birth to their first child, a son they named James Samuel Ironwood, in honor of Mason's father and their faithful foreman. Samuel, now officially Uncle Sam to the baby, was so overcome when asked to be the child's godfather that he had to leave the room to compose himself. Little James had his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from an early age, it was clear he had inherited a measure of Josephine's sensitivity. He could calm animals with a touch, and sometimes seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know. "He'll have it easier than you did," Mason assured Josephine one evening as they watched their son sleeping in his cradle. "He'll grow up knowing his gifts are just that, gifts, and he'll have us to guide him." 18 months after James's birth, the Ironwood family welcomed a daughter, Grace Marie, who arrived with a lusty cry and a shock of blonde hair like her father's. Where James was thoughtful and quiet, Grace was bold and adventurous from her first steps. "She's going to keep us on our toes," Josephine laughed as they watched their daughter attempting to climb out of her crib at just 9 months old. "She takes after her mother," Mason replied with a grin, fearless in the face of challenges. Life at the Double Circle settled into a rhythm of seasons: cattle drives in the spring and fall, haying in the summer, cozy evenings by the fire in winter. The ranch expanded, adding more land and cattle as its reputation for quality stock grew. Mason hired more hands, built a larger bunkhouse, and even added a schoolroom to the main house, where Josephine taught their children and the children of some of the married ranch hands. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Josephine by taking her back to his grandmother's herb garden in the foothills. They rode up together, leaving the children in Samuel's capable hands for the day. The hidden valley was as beautiful as Josephine remembered, perhaps even more so in the full bloom of autumn, with the aspen trees turning gold and the late-season wildflowers dotting the meadow. "I've been thinking," Mason said as they sat by the spring, sharing a picnic lunch. "We should build a small cabin up here, a place we could come for a day or two when we need time away from the ranch." Josephine looked around the peaceful valley. "I'd like that," she said. "It's special here." "It's where I first really talked to you," Mason reminded her. "Where I first realized how deeply I was falling in love with you." Josephine smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "I knew you were special the moment you said you'd be mad with me," she admitted. "No one had ever accepted me so completely before." Mason put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Best decision I ever made," he said, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Being mad with you has brought me more happiness than I ever thought possible." They stayed in the valley until sunset, talking about the past 5 years and their hopes for the future. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Josephine felt a familiar pressure behind her eyes, the beginning of a vision. Unlike the visions of danger that had plagued her in the past, this one was filled with light and joy, images of their children growing tall and strong, of the double circle expanding further, of grandchildren playing in the yard of the main house. And through it all, she and Mason, growing older together, their love a constant through the changing seasons of life. When the vision faded, Mason was watching her with understanding in his eyes. "What did you see?" he asked gently. Josephine smiled, her heart full to bursting. "Our future," she replied, And it's beautiful." Mason reached across the space between their horses to take her hand, bringing it to his lips for a kiss. "Our future started the day you rode into Park City," he said, "and every day since has been better than the last." As they approached the double circle, lights glowing warmly from the windows of the main house, Josephine felt a surge of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man who had seen her differences as strengths rather than flaws. They had built a life together, a life filled with love, with family, with purpose. And though the path had not always been smooth, every challenge had only strengthened their bond. Every obstacle overcome had proven the power of facing the world together. As Mason helped her dismount in the ranch yard, the door of the main house flew open, and their children rushed out, followed more sedately by Samuel. "Mama, Papa," James called, his serious little face breaking into a smile. "Uncle Sam let us stay up to welcome you home." Grace, now a sturdy toddler, held up her arms imperiously to her father, who swept her up with a laugh. "Did you miss us, Princess?" "Story," Grace demanded, patting Mason's cheek. "Horse story." "She wants to hear about Devil's Fury again," James explained, taking Josephine's hand. "I told her it was your story, but she wouldn't listen." Mason grinned at Josephine over their daughter's head. "What do you think, Mrs. Ironwood? Should we tell them the real story of how Mama tamed Papa's wild horse? And how Papa offered Mama a job because none of the cowboys could stomach his cooking?" Josephine added with a teasing smile. "That too," Mason agreed with a wink. "It's a story worth telling after all." As they made their way into the house, their children chattering excitedly, Josephine felt a profound contentment wash over her. The journey that had begun with fear and loneliness had led her here to a home filled with laughter, to a family bound by love, to a husband who had kept his promise to be mad with her. And in that madness, they had found a sanity more perfect than either could have imagined alone, a life built on acceptance, understanding, and the courage to face whatever came together.